resuming debate. The honourable member for Calgary Centre. Oh, too bad.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and it's a pleasure to rise in this House today to debate the motion we have on here. There's a lot in here that's economically meaty, and I think that members on the other side of the House will appreciate some of the metrics we need to put on the page here about what we do going forward. But I'm going to start with a story, because 11 days ago, I hosted a town hall meeting in the community of Killarney-Glengarry in the riding of Calgary Centre. I host these so I hear directly from constituents what their concerns are. Let me summarize what I heard. Cost of living and paying bills. In other words, inflation. Also, spiraling government debt. And no indication that this is a problem for this government. But here's a real touch point. A young woman with her first job, shopping for a home in the neighborhood to buy with her mother. She recognized the house price was beyond her reach. She wanted answers as to why. How did house prices rise so high so quickly? New home buyers can't afford homes. In case it isn't glaringly obvious yet to this government, Houston, we have a problem. Housing costs have doubled under this government's 7-year economy-destroying tenure. The best investment in Canada is a passive investment in housing, if you can afford it. It says a lot about the growth sectors that don't exist in the Canadian economy, for good reason. This government has penalized economic growth in Canada. Foreign investment has left Canada. Canadian investors have fewer choices. Canadian companies pursue growth opportunities elsewhere. Canadian pension funds, and I'll come back to that later, Canadian pension funds invest elsewhere. I said that housing prices have doubled in Canada in this government's 7-year tenure. What else has doubled? The amount of federal government debt, now at $1.3 billion and growing. How about that now sacred debt to GDP ratio? From less than 30% and declining 7 years ago to more than 50% now. And that supposed fiscal anchor is flexible. I don't think members of the government even understand that metric, let alone how to calculate it. There is one GDP, gross domestic product, in Canada. There are layers of mounting debt. Federal debt, provincial debt, corporate debt, and personal debt. Which of these didn't increase significantly over the past few years? All of these increased significantly, putting Canada's debt to GDP ratio amongst the highest in the world. Now, how does the government facilitate this massive infusion of cash into Canada's financial system? By monetary measures. You know, what the Prime Minister told Canadians he pays no attention to. So one, drop interest rates to a level close to zero, as in 0.25%, encouraging borrowing and spending, but 0.25% when inflation is recently at 5.7%, according to Statistics Canada, which always understates this measure. We are, by Canadians' experience, higher than the 7.1% inflation rate calculated in the US. And two, quantitative easing, as in when market forces won't buy the bonds the government issues to print cash, well, just buy it back and put it on the balance sheet of the Bank of Canada. So Canadians own the debt more than once. And the mispriced assets on the balance sheet of the Bank of Canada will increase the debt going forward. It's as if this government it's as if this government doesn't know that all these economic indicators are connected. Deficits lead to higher debt. Higher debt leads to higher debt service. And the need to increase taxes to pay just the interest on the debt. Lower interest rates lead to asset price inflation by definition. So this government has intentionally raised housing prices and priced new home buyers out of the market. Or there is another possibility. the government doesn't really know what it is doing. So intentional inflation and its ripple effect destroying the savings of Canadians, or incompetence. I'm going to talk about the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board. This year, deductions for the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board went up 10%. And that 10% includes 10% from the employees and 10% from the employers. And yet, the CPPIB reported that it had enough assets on its balance sheet to cover its liabilities for at least the next 75 years. So why the increase, some would ask. So when members say in this House that the CPPIB, in fact, is post-paid compensation, they need to ask the government, why do they include the Canada Pension Plan in their debt-to-GDP ratio as a government asset if it belongs to the people? And it also include the Quebec Pension Plan as the government's asset against the government's debt. And yet, it's supposedly post-paid compensation. Was this why deductions were raised 10% this year? 10% to make their balance sheets look a little better, even though it's supposed to go to Canadians going forward? Employment taxes, by the way, are the most regressive forms of taxes. They actually destroy jobs because they're applied both to the employee but also the employer. So they increase again the cost of doing business in Canada. But perhaps this is what the government is trying to give to Canadians as an indication of what to expect for inflation going forward. So an illusory 5.7% is marginal compared to the 10% they're saying is going to be indicated in their CPP deduction increases. Is this what we need to expect from inflation as Canadians? Canadians have their first taste of the effects of this government's economic mismanagement. And the government's dismissive narrative is starting to unravel, with reality hitting really hard. Madam Speaker, there are many ways this government has marginalized business in Canada so that it can no longer pursue the actual projects that have to be done in order to increase the capital stock of Canada. We no longer invest in Canada. We no longer provide the environment to invest in Canada. How many of my colleagues across the way have touted all these investments that are coming to Canada that are predicated upon a government-run subsidy program that continues to drain Canadians of their savings and putting it into all kinds of programs that are somewhat chosen, and yet we don't know the actual effects of that going down the road. We continue to destroy actually tax-producing sectors, while we continue to give money to sectors that we don't know the effect of them going forward. This is economic micromanagement at the government level that we don't know the outcome yet. Government is choosing winners and losers here. It's not necessarily going to be any good for the Canadian economy. So it's a bad taste we're getting across the entire Canadian economy. Canadians are actually finally getting their first taste with the inflation of what they should have expected when this government started running up over $500 billion in debt over the last few years. $500 billion in debt? Well, guess what? Your dollar is going to be worth less at the end of the day, so your house is going to be worth more. But you're not making any more money, so if you didn't have a house beforehand, you're not going to be able to buy a house. You're not going to be able to save for your RSP. You're not going to be able to put away enough money so that your kids actually can go to university. But I'm sure that there'll be some kind of program going forward to take care of that. However, at the end of the day, we're just draining the piggy bank of every future generation of Canadians. It is something we need to keep our eyes on here very closely. I'm asking this government to actually start pursuing some measures where they actually look at these metrics and actually bring some forward-looking perspective to the future of Canadians, because they're dealing with the present. They're spending and spending and spending. We've got to get this under control and make sure we balance our opportunities with our future. It's time to get Canada's economic fiscal house in order. Madam Speaker, thank you very much.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Well, I reject the notion, Madam Speaker, that CPP and EI are taxes. They're not. They're called source deductions as it relates to the manner in which businesses collect them. And this member's concept, or his notion that somehow just because it's on a balance sheet means that it's a tax, is inaccurate. If I have a business and I collect a benefit, I contribute and collect a benefit for an employee, that will show up on my business in the asset column, and my obligation to them to pay out later on will show up as a liability. So it's entirely correct from an accounting perspective to list the CPP as an asset, especially if there are billions and billions of dollars in there that the government is essentially managing for the people that money is owed to later on. It will show up as an asset and it will show up as a liability.
Member for Calgary Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the intervention, but I did hear what he said, and I'm going to tell the member very clearly he's in over his head with his comments there. That's not the way it works in business. You don't keep those on your balance sheet. You actually remit them to the government right away, and the government puts it over to another organization called the CPPIB, the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, which invests that on behalf of Canadians for their retirement. That's the way it works in Canada. So to continue to have it on the balance sheet of the Government of Canada when they do the calculation, what they call their debt to GDP ratio, is completely facetious, and I'll maintain that. He also talked about this being source deductions versus taxes, one versus the other. Source deductions, if they're going to be post-paid compensation, then take it off the balance sheet of the Government of Canada. That's all we're saying here. Thank you.
L'honorable député de l'Abitibi-Témiscamingue.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Pour tout le respect que j'ai pour mon collègue d'Edmonton Centre, Calgary Centre, excusez-moi, cette motion-là m'amène quand même à avoir une réflexion, à savoir est-ce que par la bande, on n'oublie pas une chose, c'est-à-dire de s'adresser directement aux pétrolières pour leur demander comment elles aussi sont capables de contribuer financièrement davantage au Trésor, à l'équilibre budgétaire canadien. Est-ce qu'il n'y a pas là une façon d'aller chercher davantage d'argent plutôt que de leur donner, comment dire, une free ride? Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Et je remercie mon collègue pour la question ici dans la Chambre des communes. Le secteur pétrolier contribue maintenant à peu près 25 milliards de dollars par année au gouvernement canadien provincial et municipal. Ça, c'est un des secteurs les plus contribuables au Canada. Ça, c'est quelque chose de grand. Je pense que c'est le plus grand secteur du Canada qui paye du taxe. Il y a des autres secteurs qui ne payent pas de taxes, comme les subventions que le gouvernement donne aux autres secteurs dans l'économie canadienne. Mais je remercie encore. Merci.
The honourable member for London Fanshawe. I'll go to you, Mr. Pearson. I'll go to you.
Commentary. And the speaker before him was talking about the government interference and how that would create winners, or the government picking winners and losers. But without true government leadership in terms of closing tax loopholes, in terms of the strengthening and expanding of social programs to create the equality and equity that we seek in our society, you are picking winners and losers. And the winners are Scotiabank, who had net profits of $10 billion, BMO of $7.7 billion, Loblaws of $1.9 billion. That's the creation of winners and losers. The losers are taxpayers. They are everyday Canadians. And so what I can't understand is why this member across continues to believe that the status quo that is hurting everyday Canadians must continue. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I don't know where my honourable colleague on the other side of the aisle believes that I think the status quo is helping Canadians. I think the status quo is a disaster for Canadians. So yes, I do think we do need to change the status quo quite considerably. There are sectors that have been protected during the pandemic by the government in charge of this, and that sector needs to kind of make sure that they step forward. There's been all kinds of corporate welfare that's been doled out through this $560 billion worth of debt the government's built up over the last handful of years. That has to change considerably. So that's what I'm after here. I'll tell my honourable member on the other side of the House again, we need to stop this corporate welfare that is destroying, and this is what we mean by winners and losers. Who's making these choices as far as giving Canadian taxpayer dollars to their own friends and relations on the other side of the House? Thank you very much.
Resuming debate, the honourable